Good evening. May I request everyone to please take their seats? On behalf of the Young FICCI Ladies Organization, I welcome you back to our offline programming after a refreshing summer break. As we get back to business, there could not be a more timely or appropriate topic to discuss and learn about. Why women cannot ignore finance and numbers. When we were choosing a title for today's discussion, it was difficult as chairperson of a leading women's business network to acknowledge this gap and put it out there as our event title. Many of us in this room, including me, are guilty of ignoring the importance of financial decision-making, whether our personal finances or those of our businesses. We have often left these decisions to our fathers, partners, or other male figures. Why has this been the case? Many of us have excelled in mathematics at school and university, so it is not that we fear numbers. Maybe it is perceived that finance is not creative enough. Maybe for too long as women, we are conditioned to leave finance to the men. This lack of control over money stops women from having a voice even today. It stops them from scaling up their businesses, and most importantly, it continues to perpetuate a patriarchal social and familial order instead of an equal one. But all of this is changing now, and our speakers today, Soumya Rajan and Devina Mehra, have been at the forefront of that change. We are truly privileged that they have flown down from Bombay to address our community. And not just that, in partnership with Soumya's firm, Waterfield Advisors, we will bring regular workshops and programming on finance and investments to you this year, so you and your business may thrive. In fact, each one of you can sign up to become part of our online finance community, where you will receive regular information curated specially for this group. This curation has been possible because of our partnership with Heritage by Waterfield Advisors. Heritage is a unique platform exclusively for women entrepreneurs, professionals, inheritors, and next-gen business leaders to help them become financially fearless through tailored wealth and advisory services and community-building initiatives. At our desk outside, please sign up to join this exclusive online finance community. At YFlow, we have a strong community and a strong voice that stands for and supports women to become leaders and decision makers. To our members, we provide opportunities for continued learning, workshops with domain experts, self-discovery, platforms for growing and showcasing their businesses, and developing a network and community of women who will always have your back. During the summer break, YFlow has been working behind the scenes to support social impact programs through our partnership with Empower. We are setting up safe spaces for young girls to study and learn after school, teaching them STEM subjects and encouraging them to pursue careers in technology. And we are imparting leadership skills to them. We are looking for financial support for these programs, so please find the brochures outside and give generously. I now hand over the podium to today's day chair, Soumya Loya Agarwal, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Aradhana, for setting the context. It's a real privilege today to welcome Devina Mehra, a woman who has consistently challenged the status quo in finance. Devina is the founder and chairperson of First Global, a firm she built into a globally respected asset management company with over $700 million in AUM. What's remarkable is that over 2 decades ago, she led First Global to become the first Asian firm to be listed on the London Stock Exchange, a bold move at a time when very few Indian institutions were thinking globally. And I am Ahmedabad Gold Medalist and one of the only 2 women to achieve this in the Institute's history. She brings not only academic brilliance, but also deep practical insight into how markets really work. She's been featured in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and most recently authored a best-selling book, Money, Myths, and Mantras, which breaks down investing in a language that's clear and real. Her journey reminds us that understanding finance isn't just about numbers, it's about clarity, courage, and asking better questions. We are honored to have you with us today. Can we just have a small round of applause? We're also joined by Soumya, who has redefined what it means to manage wealth with purpose and ethics. Soumya Rajan is the founder and CEO of Waterfield Advisors, India's largest independent multi-family office. Her firm advises on over $4 billion in assets. But what truly stands out is how she brings together long-term financial thinking with a deep sense of responsibility, especially around succession planning and philanthropy. With a background in mathematics from St. Stephen's in Oxford and as a fellow of the Aspen Global Leadership Network, Soumya's career has spanned both technical excellence and human insight. She works closely with India's top regulatory bodies, sits on several committees, and actively serves on the boards of nonprofits in education and mental health. What makes her story inspiring is not just the scale of her achievements, but the grounded and values-driven approach she brings to everything that she does. Having known her personally for the last 5 years, I can say with confidence that this integrity isn't just professional, it's also deeply personal. She shows us that finance, when done right, can be an instrument for continuity, care, and also meaningful change. As we listen to Devina and Soumya today, I invite each of us to reflect on what it means to take charge of our financial journeys, not just in terms of wealth, but also in terms of awareness and knowledge. These are women who have navigated the world of finance with intellect, but more importantly, with intention and integrity. Their stories remind us that finance is not just a man's world, it's actually everyone's world. And it's time more women stepped in, asked better questions, and made bolder choices. I invite Soumya on stage. I'd also like to invite Aradhana Dalmia, chairperson of YFlow Delhi, and Neeta Shivadasani, who's head of heritage and managing director at Waterfield Advisors, also a seasoned ex-banker with over 18 years of experience, to take the conversation forward and moderate the chat.
So I'll say a few words and then start. So thank you, Aradhana. Thank you, Soumya. Thank you, YFlow, for having us here. It's a privilege to be associated with your organization. And I hope you will go back today learning a lot from these two accomplished ladies. We're in a room full of women who are decision makers in every sense. Whether you're a founder, a professional, a wealth creator, and yes, each of us are CEOs of our own homes. But whether you're building a company or growing a portfolio or managing a household, one thing is very clear. Finance is not optional, and numbers, well, they don't lie. The silence around them often does. For too long, we've been told that investing is risky, it's not something which we can do, it's something which only male members can do in the family. But I think the entire paradigm shift is happening. We are definitely looking at making the shift, and all of us here are trying to make that paradigm shift for you all. If you observe some of the numbers, as of 2023, women control close to about 34% of global financial assets. Between 2018 and 2023, global wealth has grown by 40%. However, the women's share has grown by almost 51%. So it's obviously growing exponentially. In India, according to the Association of Mutual Funds, about 25% of the investors are women, and that number has grown in the last 10 years. Without taking more time, we have a different format this evening. There is a QR code on each table. What I would expect each of you all to do is to scan the QR code, and there's a poll. So it's a live poll that we are running. What we want to hear is that what is the room out here? How are they going to answer this question? And then we will open the panel discussion. So may I request each of you all to, just go through the... So the first question is, so once you've taken the poll, then just to click on submit. So the first question for our panelists is, or rather the poll is, do you get closely involved in your family's financial decisions? Has everyone completed? So we have 17 participants who said, I would be more involved, but don't know where to start. And that number is equal. I'm involved, but the primary decision, I'm involved, but not the primary decision maker.
So Devina, we'll start with you. As someone who built her financial muscle early on, what do you believe needs to change in how women are socialized around money, both at home and in the workplace? I know you always say that you didn't kind of grow up with any money talk at home, but it was just something that sparked an interest. But in today's world, how do you think we can get there?
Yeah, so I mean, I did not grow up around money talk because my parents were both in academics and had zero interest in money. I think they didn't even know their own salaries. But the point is, it wasn't as if it was any differential between how I was treated and my brothers were treated. Whereas in many families, I find that there is a differential that a lot of money talk happens among the men and the boys, and very often girls don't get to even think about or talk about money till they are in their 20s and they're either earning themselves or they've gotten married. And therefore, they do not have the context and they do not have the confidence. So worldwide data shows that the results are better for women investors, but the men are more confident. So please put it up in front of you. Confidence does not equal competence. So just because the men in your life can talk about investments doesn't mean that they are any better than you on actually doing the investment. So that's the point. So do not let these things, I mean, the socialization, a lot of things have to change, but not everything is going to change just because we say it should change. I mean, all of you who are mothers can, of course, change the conversation in your homes. But others who have not had the advantage doesn't mean that you can't make that mental switch today. You have to tell yourself, very important, there is no independence in life until you have financial independence. And while Neeta spoke about 25% of investors being women, I would like to change the language a bit. 25% of the assets are held in women's names. Does not mean they are the decision makers. I mean, very often, even in our PMS, the account may be in a woman's name, but her husband would be doing all the correspondence and asking all the questions and so on. So just because 25% is in the woman's name doesn't mean that she's the decision maker. So at the very least, whatever is in your name, you must be the decision maker. Do not delegate that. And the reason a lot of women also delegate that, besides the lack of confidence, etc., or thinking they don't have the knowledge, is also because there is often too much on the woman's plate, especially if she has work outside the home. She's doing that, then she's looking after the home and the kids and the in-laws and this and that. And then, this is one thing the husband is happy to do. So they say, ki, chalo, one thing off my plate, wo khushi se karta hai, let him do it. So that is the wrong mindset. So take charge of at least what is held in your name.
Thank you, Devina, for inspiring everybody in the room to take charge of their finances. But in your experience, what has surprised you the most about women's engagement with financial decision-making, both positives and negatives?
So I don't know if it's a surprise or not, but women they're good at savings. It's a cliche, but not so good at investments. Good meaning that they are too scared to invest. So you are hugging. See, in the risk spectrum, don't be on two ends of the risk spectrum. So don't be 100% in fixed deposits. On the other hand, don't think that you can give up your day job and become a day trader. So, so don't play fast and loose with your money on that sense, or say crypto trading karungi, So don't do that. Just do a sensible middle of the road asset allocation. You don't have to understand the last nuance in finance. You have to get the broad parameters right. And just to give you some context, if you are, let's say, saving 1 lakh every year, and so in 30 years, if you are in a bank FD kind of situation, you will have 75 lakhs. If you are investing in some multi-asset, medium risk portfolio, which maybe gives you 9.5%, you will have something like 1.7 crores. If you are investing in a little more equity-oriented portfolio, maybe giving you 12% compounded, you will be close to 3 crores. So that's the difference. 75 lakhs and 3 crores, that's like a 4 times ka difference. So you cannot afford to only save and not be sensible about investing. Because otherwise, inflation, all that will just eat away whatever you are saving. So start. And so start early. You'll see all those calculations on the net that if instead of starting at 25, you're starting at 30 or 35, you have to save a lot more. So start, even if you start small, start, and don't get paralyzed that I have to understand every last thing before I dip my toe in.
So very interesting to see that in this room, we had 6 participants who said, I lead all my financial decisions. What we want to see is we want to change this paradigm shift, right? Soumya, this question's for you, leading from the poll. In your experience, advising women across generation and various wealth levels, what are the silent barriers that hold even accomplished women back from taking charge of their finances?
First of all, it's wonderful to see this fantastic group of women, and thank you so much for having us and inviting us for this discussion. We've been working with women now for quite some time. 25% of our clients are women, and these are all accomplished women. They are inheritors, they're entrepreneurs, they're professionals, but we do see that hesitancy. And the hesitancy comes from what I think are 3 broad factors, one of which Devina actually spoke about, and I call it as multitasking. Women are very good at multitasking, and they get so absorbed in everything that they're going to do around taking care of their children, running a business, looking after the elders in the family, that they feel that they can give this activity of managing finances to their father, their brother, their spouse, because they just feel, well, it's just one less thing to do, exactly like what Devina said. But what's important is that women actually outlive men. That's a fact. And what ends up happening is that they then find themselves in very troubled situations where they come into wealth very late. and then they have absolutely no clue. And that is a terrifying moment for them. So for us, what we believe in Waterfield and what I'm hoping we can do in the ecosystem is really to say, you must understand finance. It doesn't matter whether you choose to give that responsibility to someone else because you may be busy and preoccupied with other things, but you cannot do it because you are ignorant. So the first thing everyone in the room has to do is to just make sure that they're fully conversant with what it means to be financially literate. So the multitasking, you cannot ignore the financial aspect, so that's start focusing on that. The second reason why I think a lot of accomplished women do not, or they hesitate around finance, is because they're always afraid of how they will be judged, particularly if they make a mistake. So will the family members and everybody come down like a ton of bricks on you because you've, quote unquote, lost money? That's not the reason why you invest. You invest because there is risk and that there is a possibility that you could lose money. What you want to do is to make sure that you take an informed decision when you are investing. So the fear of being judged can come down quite heavy on women, and I think it's more socioeconomic for Indian women as well. So I would say that's the second reason.
Yeah,
that you
I would just like to add to that, it is also often the woman's self-talk. It's the husband telling her कि तुमको नहीं मालूम था क्यों किया, तुम तो बेवकूफ हो, why did you need to do this? And that's also her self-talk. And when the man loses money, often the wife will not even ask why spoil the peace in the home. In fact, I put this in some group, and most of them said कि we won't even let our wives know. उसको पता ही कैसे लगेगा that we've lost money, So that's the difference between, and if you are investing in a risk asset like equity, you will lose money at some point. I mean, that's the truth of the matter. There's never going to be an investor who will never lose money. So sorry, Soumya.
No, I'm glad you came in on that point. And I think just the last thing is just the lack of financial preparedness, which is really around the fact that all of you in this room are financially independent or some sense of financial independence, but is everyone necessarily financially literate? And there is a big difference in that. And I think what Vicky YFlow is trying to address is really how can you become just better versions in terms of your own financial literacy.
So going back to, I can see again 21 people have said, I would like to be more involved but don't know where to start. So, my take is that you should start now. It's never too late. Everybody has this thing that at a particular age we've not done anything, but it's never too late. You should start now, So go back with a resolution that this is something that you're going to, work on. And it's something which is not difficult at all. The question again is for you, Soumya, is that for women who are partially involved, we see a lot of people who are partially involved in taking financial decisions, but not yet leading their financial decisions, which is also what is there in our poll. What are these small intentional steps that one can take today to shift that dynamic?
The first is actually, I think you do need to manage a small corpus on your own, irrespective of what that size is. And you may feel a little not fully equipped to deal with how do I even manage a small corpus. And I think that's where working with advisors, mentors, people who can guide you on that journey is quite important. Sometimes unless you actually put money to work, you will never really learn the nuances. Otherwise, it will just remain fairly theoretical. So I would say that whatever that sum of money is, you need to start investing. They normally say, they have this quote which says, it's not about timing the market, it's about time in the market. So it's almost like you are trying to be consistent in at least understanding how your different markets are working. And because you are an investor, you will start reading a bit more, you will start educating yourself a bit more. So I think just the fact that you have a corpus and start investing that is very important. The size doesn't matter. Most people think, do I need to, again, have a large corpus to even learn the basics? That's not true. Every small amount does count. For individuals here who may be in family businesses, who are inheritors, many of you may find that your family business may have an investment council, it may have an investment committee. What's important is for you to not necessarily say that, hey, I want to be part of the investment committee, but to really observe as an observer in those committees, how are decisions being taken? How are products being presented? What is the rationale that a group of people are taking for why should I invest in this product? That's a great way to learn. And in some sense, it will also give you the confidence in order to start asking the right questions. Because investing, like many other things, is about asking the right questions. And that curiosity is something that must be there. So don't try to jump right in and say, you know, I need to be on this investment committee. You need to earn your stripes and the right to also participate and be a seat on that table. So that means educating yourself as well.
Thank you.
There are no such things as stupid questions. I mean, I'm saying this especially since a lot of women in a group find that they feel that, you know, this will be too basic or too silly and let me not ask. So that's why.
And also, you know, to assist you on this journey, we have a tie-up with Waterfield this year where not just a series of workshops, but we are building an online finance community. So your learning continues and you get the correct advice, good advice, and you also get to start your investment journey. We'll also move on to our next poll. So if you could scan the QR code again. This question is about where are women investing today? So which of the following asset classes have you invested in? The options are gold, real estate, stock markets, private markets such as private equity or venture cap, art, or none of the above. I'd request everybody to please participate by scanning the QR code. And we'll wait for the results. Are you able to see the question? There's no option all of the above. There's an option only for none of the above. So maybe you can pick.
So you can pick none of the above is all of the above.
No, you can pick whichever one you maybe invest in
so
most.
So do both then.
Yeah.
So do all then.
It should allow you to put it in more than one.
Yeah. Maybe the one that you have invested in the most, you could just select that.
None of the above. 42% is none of the above.
No, 42% is stocks.
42 stocks, okay. Equities. The last one, none of the above is the other place.
Is zero. Stocks and gold.
Interesting.
Real estate.
Real estate.
Has everybody had a chance to vote? So, interestingly, the top asset class is stocks, which is direct equity or mutual funds or portfolios.
And the second is gold.
And the second, of course, is gold, which is very interesting. I don't think we came in thinking that 42% would be stocks, so that's wonderful to see that everybody's already engaged. I think one, maybe private markets is the one where we see low engagement from most of the women here, either in venture cap or private equity. And 7% of you have invested in art, and I know this is quite a popular one for women in Delhi. It's good to see that none of the above is 0%. So Soumya, we'll start with you. Based on your work with multiple generations of families, how do you see the financial involvement of daughters and daughters-in-law evolving?
Fascinating question. And I've kind of always thought about this as putting the baby boomers and Gen X on one side, and then the millennials and the Gen Z on the other. because I think they both operate quite differently from what we've seen. And that's really because when you look at the baby boomers and the Gen X, they are aware of India as a scarcity economy. So for them, it was about saving. Whereas for the millennials and Gen Z, they've not necessarily seen the kind of scarcity that earlier generations have seen. And for them, it is about investing. So there's a difference between saving and investing and what the definition of financial freedom is. If you ask a baby boomer or a Gen X, financial freedom for them, and I'm a Gen X, financial freedom was to be able to retire comfortably. So you had enough money so that, you could live a good life by the time you retired after working or whatever else you were doing. Whereas the definition I see for financial freedom for millennials and Gen Z is the ability to work on my own terms. So it's very different in terms of the way they will even approach an investment. So for us, just that definition itself is different. And then you then come to the next part, which is around what are the opportunities that today daughters and daughters-in-law technically have? I remember when we started Heritage, Neeta and I were always of the view that we would go to the spouses of the men who we were managing, and that they would then want their spouses to be part of this program. Except that when we went, we found that the patriarchs in the family wanted their daughters and their daughters-in-law to be part of the financial literacy program. So that was so different in terms of mindset. But what you have today in terms of the next generation is that you have much more by way of platform, tools, how you can educate yourself. You've got YouTube, you've got finfluencers, you've got so much out there in terms of information that earlier generations never had. And even if you look at mutual funds, I think we spoke a little bit about, the kind, the global numbers and the global numbers, 30%. Women are going to, in India, have about 30% control of the wealth. The fastest growing category for the mutual fund industry is women investors under the age of 35. So that is incredibly interesting. And it just tells you that they need the knowledge, they need the platforms, they need the literacy, because if they are going to not look at wealth as just being, I'm saving my money, but investing my money and growing my money, then that's a completely different mindset.
I liked your observation about how the men leading family businesses wanted their daughters and daughters-in-law to learn about finance, but not necessarily their wives. It's very interesting.
And I'll tell you what the conversation was when we went to some of them. They said that if you start talking to my wife, she will come back and tell me that why did you not invest here and why did you invest here? So I will be prone to asking or answering all those questions and not want to give any of the answers. So it's better that my daughter gets involved.
So we have an opportunity to change that over here. So to all the mums out there, please do take control and do learn about finance.
Soumya, leading to what Aradhana just asked, do you find that women entrepreneurs or inheritors invest differently than the male counterparts? And if so, how would you guide them?
So I've always felt that they do behave differently. Maybe Divina has another view, but I do feel that men and women are different in the way in which they invest. I actually coined a kind of acronym which I called a woman's touch. TOUCH actually stands for what I think is a little different about how women invest. The T is really for what I feel is that women trade less. So they don't necessarily churn their portfolios or keep making a lot of changes to their portfolios. Once they're committed to something, they kind of stay there for some time. So I think that's one attribute that I've seen at Waterfield. They stay with the investment. O is where I say they're oriented more towards goals. So when they're thinking of their finances, it's not always about speculative gain. A lot of people will say, I'm investing because I want to get X% return. I see that for women, it's always more goal-oriented. It's because they're investing because of their children's education, they're investing for their business, they're investing for a foundation, but it's always very specific, and therefore the investments also need to reflect what is the outcome that you're looking for in terms of the goal. U is around using sustainable strategies. That's one of the things we see women are much more driven towards. There's a certain values and purpose around which they are investing. And I think that's something that at least I've seen very personally at close quarters at Waterfield. Even research shows that Morgan Stanley actually brought out a report that said that 87% of women are more inclined to use sustainable strategies than men at 81%. So that was an interesting phenomenon, very specific to women. C is because I think they're very conscious decision makers. Everyone normally says women are risk averse. That's not something that I like. And you would have seen, I think, one of the hoardings outside, which talk about the fact that women are, I feel, are more risk aware. They are aware of the risk. They're more informed of why they're making a particular investment, and that's a good thing. And H, of course, is because I think they hold diverse portfolios. You'll very rarely see a woman only in one asset class. She will at least have 2, maybe 3. So just like we've seen stocks, gold, real estate, potentially it's always slightly more than one. So touch, T-O-U-C-H, is what I think is slightly different about the way in which women invest as opposed to men. But
I love the acronym.
I think you will have more data on this. But just to add, I mean, once I was discussing in a mixed group on this, and the men said that women don't have this compulsion to or need to boast that I made this, I picked this great stock and I've made so much, and which makes them more sensible decision makers, which is what some of the things you were talking about, that they are more conscious decision makers and they are more oriented towards their goals, whereas the man is probably a little more oriented towards about what to talk about at the next cocktail party, and they don't want to be questioned, as you said, by the wives as to why they did certain things. So, so that part is, instead of being focused on the goals, probably, that's what you mean also, that the women are more focused towards the goals, and whereas the men have all these ancillary things. And it is only a myth to say that women are more emotional or whatever. I mean, the most murders are committed by men, so how can you say that women are the more emotional? Because they are not carried away by emotions to that extent.
So perhaps we need to make it cool at our own cocktail parties to discuss our best investment rather than the next best bag, perhaps. Devina, moving on to you. You've just, you've always invested across geographies and asset classes and always encouraged people to not put all their eggs in one basket or even in one country. So what are the biggest blind spots you feel women have when it comes to global diversification of their portfolio?
Okay, so I mean, first of all, I just wanted to tell you that you just need to get the broad parameters right in general of your entire investments. Don't freeze in the spot. So asset allocation determines most of your returns. So just if you can get the broad asset allocation right, you do not need the formula to multi-baggers. Just getting basic asset allocation means 85% to 90% of your portfolio is already optimized. So asset allocation doesn't mean, I mean, it sounds very fancy, but all it means is categories of assets. So equity, whether directly or indirectly, is all equity. Then there's fixed income, which is from fixed deposits onto fixed income mutual fund. Then you have all these categories, real estate and gold and all that. But the other dimension of assets which is often forgotten is geography. So asset allocation doesn't mean just assets within India. And I often give this statistic that when I started working, the dollar was 12 rupees. So in the course of less than a career, rupee has depreciated by 90%. So you cannot forget this when you are planning for 20, 30 years ahead, as most people do. And also now, in fact, hard currency expenses have gone up. More people study abroad, more kids study abroad. Many people say that after I retire, since my children are abroad, 6 months I'll spend there. So basically all those things mean, and that was really also my motivation for going global back in 1999, that you should not put all your eggs in one basket. And part of the wake-up call was the Asian crisis of the late 90s, when in 1 year, all these so-called Asian tigers, not basket case economies, but the Asian tigers lost 50 to 90% of their market value in just 1 year. 50% for Taiwan, 90% for Indonesia, South Korea, Philippines, all that in between. And I had spent 6 months in Indonesia during my Citibank days, and I thought, if I was an Indonesian, 90% of my net worth was gone in a year. So that was a wake-up call that don't put all your eggs in one basket, be global. And being global doesn't mean buying one NASDAQ ETF or buying 5 or 7 stocks you know the names of, or your fund manager knows the name of. So actually what happens is, in India, very few people have true global expertise. So they will also tell you the well-known names. You buy the 7 tech stocks here, you buy 3 China stocks, or you buy a NASDAQ ETF. But in markets, there is one thing which is true, that is no theme does well forever. No geography, no asset class, no industry or sector. So things change. There's been a long time when US has done very well, 10, 12 years. Doesn't mean it will always do well. There have been long periods when it hasn't done well also. So you need a truly global portfolio. So along with women taking more of an interest in investing, Indians diversifying globally is also a cause for me. So that's why I started a product which actually starts at $10,000. So just 8.5 lakh rupees, you can get exposure to all the countries in the world and all asset classes practically. And normally you would not get it for less than $1 million. But this, as I said, is a cause for me that Indians in particular do not invest overseas. And part of the reason is that earlier you could not invest overseas. No, well after I started working, and the young people in the room will not know this, if you were going, let's say, to London or New York or whatever, you could take only $500. And that too once in 3 years. If you went more frequently than once in 3 years, you had to fly out with $20 in your pocket. That was the law. So our grandmothers were not wrong in buying gold, because gold was the only effective global asset you could buy. So the dollar chart of gold is more volatile than equities, but the rupee chart of gold looks fine because it's really a rupee depreciation chart. But now you are not stuck to gold. Now you can truly invest overseas, because that liberalized remittance scheme of RBI allows you to invest $250,000 per person per year. Family of 4 can send out 8.5 crore rupees a year. So you must look at global diversification over a period of time, have at least 30–40% overseas. And that's not particular to women investors. That's a blind spot, I think, of most Indian investors. No, that's not something they have thought about really.
So Devina, just taking off, you just mentioned that there are no themes which kind of, continue to, deliver. Do you see any recent trends which you are personally excited about? And do you think the audience here would, like to hear some of the themes that you are thinking?
See, it's a trap to say, what are your high conviction ideas? Whenever people ask me, what are your high conviction ideas?
Everyone's hoping for stock tips also.
No, that's what I'm saying, because high conviction ideas means what? That you have bought into a narrative, that you believe a story. And once you believe a story, so this is the problem now with human beings, we are storytellers, and we don't remember data, we remember stories. Absolutely. And we learn through stories. And this is something that is common across all civilizations, from the most sophisticated to the unknown jungle tribes. And across time, that we are storytellers. And that's why all effective advertisements are stories. If I tell you 5 lakh people in this district are 5 lakh kids are malnourished, you'll turn the page. You give a picture or a video of a single family who's malnourished, you will give to that charity. So that's how the human mind works. But in investing, the stories are a trap. And the problem is, you tell your story enough times, you also start to believe it. So that's the biggest trap. So you should never say this theme will do well forever. And it's very difficult to predict. I mean, people come to me and say that you found HDFC Bank in 1996, you found Amazon in 2001. Tell us which is the next HDFC Bank. I'll buy for my my toddler and forget for 20 years. I said, anybody who tells you they have a crystal ball for 20 years is fooling you. Nobody knows in advance which is going to be a multi-bagger. No investor, no fund manager in the world has had a record of, let alone 100% multi-baggers, even 50% multi-baggers. So the way to do is to have a sensible portfolio which is 25, 30 stocks, and be certain out of those 25, 30, 6, 7 are going to be complete duds that you need to get out of. The rest might give you reasonable return, and if you are lucky and if you've chosen well, maybe 2, 3 will be multi-baggers, but you don't know. Otherwise, if you knew in advance, you would invest in only those 2, 3. I also talk about, for example, Rakesh Jhunjhunwala is a known name. Every time you would meet Rakesh, he would talk of different stocks. He did not know that I'll make all my money in Titan, CRISIL and Lupin. And Titan also wouldn't have known, because I recently read this book by the Titan CEO called The Tanishq Story. And you see how many ups and downs that company went through. There were multiple times where they were debating whether to shut down the jewelry business. That kind of crisis. It's just that Tatas are benign. People said, okay, 6 mahina aur dekh lo, 1 saal aur dekh lo. It went through. But you don't know in advance. Jeff Bezos did not know in advance that he'd become at one point the richest man in the world, or HDFC Bank. It is very unpredictable. So long term you cannot say, and you should never anyway invest in narrow themes. That's always, again...
You should have just a portion of your portfolio in a theme.
Yeah, never have a... in basics of, I said, keep to basics of risk management. So one basic is this, not to have too much exposure to any single category, whether it's a country or industry theme. So even if you like an industry a lot, don't have 40% of your money there. So one of the myths that is talked about is that invest in your circle of competence, invest in what you know. But that means you are investing in a very narrow list of stocks. And as an individual, fine, you can still pick a few stocks. But if your fund manager says that, then if the fund manager only understands, let's say, consumer brands and banks, what are they going to do when the theme changes? And the themes always change. And even if a business is steady, doesn't mean the stock will remain steady. That's another thing altogether. And many times, even the books you read of investors, like the famous investors like Peter Lynch, who's written this One Up on Wall Street, which was about these kind of things, that my wife really liked the pantyhose of this company, so I bought the stock of this company. That's for a particular place in a particular time in the 80s and part of the 90s. They were very good times for consumer brands in the US. Doesn't mean that thing works always. So, always, as I said, we always try to think of every quarter we look at our portfolio afresh, that if we had cash today, which are the best ideas?
Thank you. So, we have a lot of small entrepreneurs amongst our members. And one thing that we've seen is that very often there's a fear to scale. And that inflection point when they go from being a small business to a medium or to a scaled up big business, that's a point that they debate a lot, and then they often turn back and remain a small business. So, Soumya, what would you recommend to them, to these entrepreneurs who are starting out? How can they sort of let go of this fear?
That's a really tough question, because there are two parts to scaling a business, and I think particularly for women entrepreneurs, perhaps that's the single biggest challenge that they always face, is that I've started this company, but what next for that company? Statistics are actually not that favorable for women entrepreneurs. I think about 20% of MSMEs today are owned by women. Of that, 82% are actually what we call solopreneurs, or which have people who you've employed, which may be less than 5 people. So none of these enterprises are really at scale. But the reason why I think a lot of people struggle, or women struggle particularly, is around 2 facets. One is just the mindset. The mindset that they can actually succeed. Most of the time, I think we come in with the thinking that we're not going to make it, and that there's no point my even trying because I will not succeed. That is really around creating a certain level of mental toughness So just like in sport, ultimately the person who may win may not necessarily be the person who is physically or more talented. It's ultimately the person who has the mental strength to actually win. So that mindset shift that women need to make to say that I am building a business, creating a business because I want it to scale, and I will put my head down and scale this and make that mental resolve that I will win, is something that most women find quite difficult to do because of the social conditioning and everything else that, this is just a side hustle in my household. It's not really the main thing. So that's, I think, one. The other is just the access to capital itself. Again, the statistics are quite loaded against women here. Globally, only 2 to 3% of VC funding goes to women. In India, the statistic is very similar. And women do find it a challenge to raise capital. I can give you my own example. I've raised capital 4 times since Waterfield started. The first 3 times I was raising money from family offices because I always thought that, they'll be good patient capital. And they are good patient capital. But they won't give you the kind of capital that you need to scale. So it was only earlier this year that I actually raised institutional capital. And for me, that was a mindset. And it took me 14 years to get to that point where I felt that I would be comfortable to have an institutional investor and that I would be able to return that capital, because there's a sense of responsibility also, I think, that sits for women, that if they have an obligation of some sort, then how is it that I'm going to make sure that I deliver on that expectation? So this is very, I think, unique to women. It'd be very hard to explain this to a man. And the reason why then on accessing capital, you also need more women on the other side. As investors, to be able to understand the dilemma and the mindset when women go out to actually scale their business. I think you had comments as well.
So I'd just like to add that it is not just that the number of women founders get less capital, but they actually did a study which was like, what happens in the room when founders present to venture capitalists. And they found consistently a pattern that women are questioned more about the risks and what can go wrong, whereas the male founders are asked about what's the size of the opportunity, how big can your company get. So when raising money, be cognizant of that dynamic, and even if you are being questioned like that, you keep steering the conversation back to the size of the opportunity. And so that you get the same access that a male founder gets. And don't be disheartened by rejections. Don't take it personally. Realize that there is a bias. And it might sound a little goofy, but also affirmations, and I'm a big believer in affirmations. I'm a big believer in visualizing your goals, and visualizing your goals not as in the future, but this has happened, this is done. And I'm happy that this is done. So when I applied for my Bombay Stock Exchange card, people told me don't even apply. You were never to get it because NSE was not there, SEBI was not there, BSE was a brokers club, and they said, "वो अपने भाई भतीजे को देंगे, तुमको क्यों देंगे?" And plus, Bombay Stock Exchange was 80% Gujarati, 20% Marwadi. He said, "You are a total outsider, a woman on top of that. Don't even apply." I know people who didn't even apply that you won't get it. So I always say that, for me, the biggest example of manifestation is that BSE card materialized, how many things connected in hindsight, and ultimately I got 2 extra marks for my IIM gold medal, which pushed me over the cutoff. So they did try not to give it, but that was not a list I needed to top. I was number 69 out of 71 new members, but I got it. So it's often also, I find that women hold themselves back even in terms of marketing themselves. And this, very strangely, we recently had a a Zoom call of women authors who were alumni of the IIMs. So I was one of them because I recently wrote this book. And what was the strangest part was that people have a business education from the IIM, and across the board, the theme that came across to almost all of them said the same thing, that I feel very queasy about pushing my book. I feel very diffident about marketing myself. I can talk about your book, but I feel very, I hold back on my own book. And I told them that when I was writing my book, I was asking a friend, and they told me that you have to market your book. He said, even a person like Nandan Nilekani, when you meet him within the first 5 minutes, he tells you he has written this book. So you be in that mindset and start telling everybody you've written the book. So this showed me that even, that socialization is so deep that business education at IIM also had not overruled that people were still thinking that it doesn't look nice to be so pushy. And coming from Lucknow, for me, that's like a double thing, that you being self-effacing and being so-called humble or modest was so much of a virtue that it's very hard to go out and talk about what you are doing and sort of push yourself. But that is what is required in the world.
So just to both of you, for our young entrepreneurs, any important financial guidelines they should always keep in mind when they're taking in their businesses from 0 to 1 to 2?
So normally as an entrepreneur, at least what I found personally is that the first 3 years, you really don't know what you're doing. You have an idea, you have a plan, you have a kind of business plan, which I think is the first thing that you need to try and make. And in that business plan, if you look at some of the financial metrics that you should look at is, first of all, you'll have startup expenses, you'll have your inventory, your license requirements, just space that if you may want to take that. You'll then have things like your cost of acquisition for a customer. You need to understand typical VC terms like burn rate. So in terms of how much are you spending vis-a-vis how much you're getting in. What is cash flow? I think ultimately all businesses will survive if they have good cash flow. So you need to be quite cognizant in the early days about having the business plans, sticking to some of those metrics, and really trying to figure out the business. I know it took me about 3 years to just understand what were the different dynamics or different levers that you have in terms of revenue as well as your cost. But it's important to try and manage within the revenue in the first instance. But that's not always easy, because when you're starting a business, you have to invest in growing that business first before the revenue starts coming in. So not easy, but having a business plan is a good idea. The other is that if you do decide to raise capital, you need to remember that the process always takes quite long, longer than you may estimate. And also that your business plan, you may say that I will break even in 6 months or 1 year. Chances are always add another year to it. And then you're likely to be in that margin of safety in terms of the business that you're building. We always underestimate the runway. And particularly for entrepreneurs, ultimately it's the resources that you need to build and scale. So if those resources get crunched, then the business can't grow. So try to be a little bit more, not overtly optimistic, but try to be at least as practical as you can.
So do you think a mentor is required to, kind of handhold? Devina, this is for you. Because, when you're an entrepreneur, it's important to, kind of keep all these checks and balances so that the business is
If you can get a mentor, fine, but not everybody will be able to get it. And to add to what Soumya was saying, really just underline that always get money to run the business for a few years. Otherwise, you might be close to break even and you run out of money, you'll have to close the business. So always raise more than you think you will need. But also, don't try to, unless you plan to be on a very small scale, don't plan to be just chasing break-even. Because if you look at all the venture capital successes, those were not companies which tried to break even very, very early. So they first look to scale and then break even. So, that, but then you need to have that money to be able to spend. Also, often we make a great product, but we have no money left to market it. So unless you budget for that, you will not be able to actually get the revenues even if you have a great product or service. So you need to budget for marketing, you need to budget for expenses for longer than you need, which is what Soumya was saying, that even if you think you will break even in 6 months, you budget for at least 2 years of expenses. So otherwise, then you will otherwise remain that cottage industry level.
So just in terms of just adding a little bit to the comment around VC funding or just taking money, the dilemma for most entrepreneurs is always around the dilution and the equity that you will hold. And people have different strategies. There are times when you will decide you want to bootstrap your company, you wanted to get to a certain scale and only then bring in larger amounts of capital because you don't want to dilute too fast. I've seen just the opposite as well. In many of the larger VC-funded companies that you see, the actual entrepreneur holds very little equity because they've given up most of their equity because they've raised large amounts of capital to scale very quickly. That, I think, is a very personal choice, whether you want to really be somebody who has maybe 2 or 3% in the company, but you created this massive scale, or whether you really want to have some, be an entrepreneur that has much more skin in the game through the equity that you have. Of course, there are lots of other ways in which you get economics, even if you have very little equity. But I feel, at least for me, I remember personally, holding more equity was important so that I felt at least I had more control over the business. And I came from a corporate sector. I spent 17 years in banking before becoming an entrepreneur. And for me, I left the corporate sector because I wanted to kind of create something on my own. And I felt that if you had too many strings attached to raising capital, then that really wasn't why I left the corporate sector to start my own company. So these are very personal choices that people will make in terms of you want to bootstrap, you want to scale, you want to raise institutional money, and when. Those are the choices.
And also how much money you have to start with to have those options.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
So Soumya, this question's for you. Within Waterfield's Heritage Program, what are some of the interesting shifts that you've seen in women's investing journey? Whether it's philanthropy, is it alternates, is it sustainable investing? So what are some of the shifts that you've seen?
So I think the shift that we've really seen, and this is more from women inheritors, is their interest in private markets. And I found this to be, I didn't expect it, let me put it that way. But I just feel that what these women inheritors are capable of doing is to use the money that they may have inherited to start working in the ecosystem that supports other women. So you actually see them as having funds. They've created fund structures. They also start supporting social enterprise and enterprise which have a sustainability lens. And in some form, they've really taken the quality of stewardship to another level, because they're really looking at, I have this money, I've inherited this money, what can I do for the good of the larger society through the money that I have? So that's a wonderful phenomena. So a lot of people will say, she's only inherited the money. She doesn't know how to look after the money. And can be a very damning statement. But I do feel that actually these women are extremely capable of putting that money to a wider and a better cause in the longer term. 30% of India's wealth is going to be controlled by women in the next 5 years. Those women who have inherited this money are capable of doing a lot with that money for the larger social good. So that's a wonderful change that you see, and they're eager to understand how does impact investing work, how can I support social enterprises through philanthropy? How can I support them through capital that I can give? How can I support them through mentorship? These are all the things that women are capable of doing. So I'm personally excited about this particular shift that I actually see, which will play out in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. Thank you.
So actually at YFlow, we also give you the opportunity to participate in this social impact journey with our partnership with Empower this year. And we have our brochures and cards outside, so I'd encourage you to pick up one and see how you'd like to join it. Should we move on to our next poll?
This is the last poll for the day. The question is, what is the next financial action you are most likely to take in the next 3 months? Review my existing portfolio.
I think someone had a question.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So
We'll just do Q&As right after this segment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So does this allow for more than one
you can do
option?
more than one, right?
No, I think just one option.
What is the 10? 24?
24 is review my existing portfolio more actively. So the good part is that there are portfolios. It's very positive.
Yes, interesting to see that 28 people have said review my existing portfolio more actively and start investing in a new asset class is the next one. So any thoughts from both of you on this? Is this a general trend you see out there?
So I hope people have got a little more confident, which is what I take this to indicate, that you are talking about reviewing your own portfolio and investing in a new asset class means you are a little more comfortable about taking charge of your money.
So just quickly, we'll just ask, a few closing thoughts before we open up for Q&A. Soumya, this is for you. One financial lesson that changed your life.
So I started in financial markets in 1994, and this was with Grinleys, ANZ Grinleys, and their head office was just opposite the stock exchange. So in 1994, you used to have all these carts which had those physical forms for investing into different stocks. And 1995, when the HDFC IPO happened, I remember putting my first small amount of money into HDFC Bank's IPO, and I still hold that stock from that initial allotment that I got. And what it's shown me is the power of compounding, which is something that I think all investors, you should remember. I remember putting in a small amount of 10,000 rupees at that time because that's all I could afford. I wish I had more then, but it was from my salary, and it just showed me, just in front of my eyes, what the power of compounding can do. So, huge benefit there.
Thank you.
Sorry, but there's also on the flip side, at the same time, you would hear tips from your colleagues, say, buy this stock and buy that stock, and I would get quite taken in and decided, the couple of names, if I rattle off, Devina, you will know. It also taught me that do not go after those stock tips. Please do research a little bit in terms of what you're investing in, because that's where you can lose money. So both things happened in those years. Lost money because of penny stocks and made money because you invested in blue chips.
Devina, this is for you. One habit or mindset that you would urge every woman in this room to cultivate?
Take charge of your money and do the simple things right. You don't have to get intimidated by all the chatter around markets. So good investing is fairly boring, it's fairly simple. You stick to those simple things.
Thank you. Soumya, you, what gives you hope about the next generation of women investors?
That they are investors and not savers.
And Devina, I can't go away without you talking about one book that you would encourage every woman to read besides your own book. Because I know that you have a list of books. Yeah, I've taken that list from you, and I would love you to give one name.
It is difficult to recommend only one book. In fact, the last chapter of my book is 5 categories of books you should read. But of course, depends on where you are on your journey. So if you think you don't even know the finance basics, then you can learn that either through a book, or as Soumya was saying, now there are, right from university courses being available free to YouTube. There are many things. But also think about all the ways, and this is not specific only to investing. In everything in life, your own brain trips you up. And while I love Daniel Kahneman's books, but those are little difficult to read. If you want an easier version of those kind of things about all the biases that exist in your mind, the first book you can start with is The Art of Thinking Clearly.
Yes.
So that will tell you all the ways your own mind trips you up, and why that is so difficult to get rid of those biases, right from the fact that you hate to book a loss. And a 1 lakh rupee loss hurts you more than the joy a 1 lakh rupee profit gives you. So all those things are very hardwired, so you can read that. And of course, as I said, if you don't know the finance basics, read the finance basics. You can read according to your interest some books about business journeys. I spoke about the Tanish story, but there are books on Amazon, on Nike, and a lot of times you will find, and as entrepreneurs also, that's very important, that normally the one-line story of a company appears very simple and very great, that this company started here and it reached here, but the actual trajectory is like this. So as an entrepreneur, again, you need not get intimidated when things go wrong in your business, because things go wrong in every business. And the business have to change, they have to adapt, because nothing goes as you expected. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, sometimes in a different direction. So once you read those books about various businesses, you'll understand that a little better.
Thank you.
Maybe we can compile a list of your recommendations and share it on our community.
As I told you, that's the last chapter of my book.
Okay, so the first book you need to buy is Devina's. Thank you so much. We'll open up for some questions and answers. There's mics going around, so please use the mic. Yeah, can we start?
Hi, this is Nisha Agarwal. I have a good amount of portfolio, and now I want to invest in real estate in Dubai, because I see it's going up a lot in the last 5 years. But I don't want to directly invest in real estate. So do you recommend any fund or any MF for that, which invest in Dubai properties?
I haven't studied that. I'm not a big fan of real estate as investment, though. I mean, there have been some Dubai developers who've been talking to me that maybe we should put a structure in place, exactly what you're talking about. Normally real estate has a lot of illiquidity risk, and in Dubai it's already run up a lot, so I'm not sure whether it's the best time to enter. And I haven't studied that subject to tell you that this is the structure through which you can invest.
So you don't want to take a real estate property. You want to invest in a fund which is the underlying is real estate.
Not directly into.
Okay. I don't think this is a structure.
May I ask, please? May I ask? Yeah. I never know when to sell. Yeah, that's me. I never know when to sell, whether it's mutual funds or equity. Like I'll give you an example that when the Hindenburg case happened, so everybody said don't buy Adani, but I had an instinct and I bought it at 1,200. And now it's about 2,500. It rose very fast to 2,000 plus, but then it's kind of stabilized at 2,600. So should I be selling? I mean, I'm just giving one example, right? So I never know when to sell, when to hold.
Yeah, good question. Because in fact, even if you ask professional fund managers, everybody has a very good story on how they buy or how they identify stocks to buy. You ask them how to sell and how deeply they've thought about risk, most will not have an answer. So one very simple thumb rule to follow in when to sell is, one, you buy something, don't have a target price that when it reaches here, I will sell. So if you buy something at 50, don't say if it reaches 100 or 200 or 300, I will sell, because that way you will miss out on the multi-baggers, what Soumya was talking about, HDFC Bank. Okay, so but always have a stop loss. So we have a more elaborate system, but and this is the strange part. I mean, I've written about this, that have a trailing stop loss. And the strange part was in a professional investors meet, somebody who's actually quite old told me that this was the one thing that I really understood from your book. And I was surprised. I said, like, this person is a professional investor and they have not really thought about trailing stop loss. So what does trailing stop loss mean? That if you buy something at 50 rupees and let's say you have a 25% stop loss, it doesn't mean that your stop loss gets fixed at 37.5. So if the stock goes to 100, then comes to 90, you continue to hold. It goes to 150, 160, comes down to 140, you continue to hold. It goes to 200 and then comes back to 150. So now it's down 25% from the top. So 25% trailing stop loss means not from your purchase price, but from the high. So when the high retraces 25%, you exit. I mean, you might again buy that stock at another time, but from a risk management perspective, that's that's an easy thumb rule to follow. That keep holding the stock till it hits the stop loss, or of course, if you have a better place to invest in.
Hi, two questions quickly. One, what's your point of view on crypto? Have you personally invested, and any guidance you can give us? And second, with the advent of AI, do you see the data available for investment? Is there any movement, anything that will help us invest more wisely in doing research?
Okay, in terms of crypto, my view is not that it's not a valid asset class. So even back in 21, I'd written a few primers on crypto, and my takeaway was that it's fine, it can be a asset class, but also even in its limited history, there have been many times when it has fallen 70 to 85%. So it's an extremely volatile asset class. And thereafter also the same thing happened. That 21 time there was a boom, then there was a crash, then there's again a run up. So it's an extremely volatile asset class. So in our global funds, at times we have held not crypto directly, but assets related to that, but only to the extent of 2, 3, 4%, never more than that. It's not something where you should have 25, 30% of your portfolio. In small quantities, it evens out your returns a bit, because it's not very correlated with everything else, but it is not, it's an extremely volatile asset class, so you should not have a big exposure to that. What was your second question? AI. Okay, so yes, I mean, that's a very good question actually, because see, what has fundamentally changed in markets is that 25, 30 years ago when I started this business, in fact, at that time there was no equity research in India. I mean, there was no concept. We didn't even have a course in IMA on equity research because that career didn't exist. No company met investors or stock research analysts or anything. But the point is, the way money was managed in the 90s is the way it's still being managed for the most part. But something fundamental has changed. In the 90s, what was your edge? It was getting information. I mean, you had to, when you meet companies, I used to come to NCR for 3 days and meet 15 companies, and when Gurgaon was a wild west, really. I mean, I can't recognize the place now. So, but that was the case all over the world, that you could have an information edge. Even in the US, a large fund like Fidelity could sit in a room with an IBM or P&G and get information. Now, by law, all across the world, no differential information can be provided to anyone. So even if you have a fund manager or analyst meet, the transcript has to be there on the company website. So now information is available, data is available. So what is the edge? The edge is not information. Now the edge is, how do you analyze these masses of data? And that is where AI comes in. So we actually started our PMS with AI machine learning 5 years ago, and not because it was fashionable or it was available, but because that was the need of the hour. That's how, I mean, the analogy I give is that, I mean, all the youngsters in the room, why is hockey our national game when we didn't achieve anything in hockey for the 50 years. I mean, we've just about started to get in the bronze range now after 50 years. So why is hockey our national game? So it was a national game because India dominated hockey from the 1920s to the 1970s. So much so that there were 2 Olympics where there was not a single goal scored against India. I mean, all the way from the first round to the finals. And so the gold was always between India and later on India and Pakistan. So what happened in the 1970s? जिसे कहते हैं hero से zero कैसे हो गए? And the reason was very simple. The playing field changed. You went from natural grass to AstroTurf, and all the skill set, that great dribbling by Major Dhyan Chand, etc., went out of the window. Now you had to be very fit, you had to be very fast, which Indians were not good at. So the playing field has changed in investing, as I said, from having access to information to analyzing information. And if you don't adapt, you cannot outperform the market. And that's why we started with AI/ML, not because, as I said, it's available, but that's the edge you can have now. So that hopefully, again, AI is an umbrella term. People ask me, do quant methods work? And I say, quant methods ka kya matlab hai? If I ask you, is something done in Excel good or bad, you would say that is absurd. It's the model, what you are making is, so AI is only a tool. What you are doing with it, what's the input, what's the quality, but it can be used as a very good tool in an era when information is available and the so-called best brains in the business are doing this.
I think my only comment is, so on crypto, while it is legally allowed, it is unregulated. So to that extent, one does have to be a little careful in terms of its allocation. But as a trend, I think digital assets will become a very important part of portfolios. And it will operate very much like, maybe today it's operating a bit like how commodities operate. So in that sense, it will find a place in the portfolio. Specifically on AI, I think all the investment firms and wealth management companies are creating these AI assistants, which are going to just churn large amounts of data. But I think to the point that Devina made, it is also around the interpretation of that. So are you interpreting it correctly or not? And what will you do in terms of the action on the portfolio from that information? So that is going to be key on whether you actually make money or you lose money.
Yeah, the next question. Hi, good evening. My name is Shruti. I'm here. This session is so great. Thank you. It couldn't have gone better. I mean, I'm so thrilled to hear each and every point. And I'm a founder of a fashion or a retail brand. And if I need to get into VC to scale or grow my brand, do I hire an in-house assistant, like a financial advisor, or can I outsource it? Like, what would be the first initial steps to get into that?
Do you have a CFO or some person in finance in your team?
A small role, not a major role. Like I am right now handling everything all together. I have a team, right, a financial team, but not such an educated CFO that could assist me with
right.
this.
So I think one of the first things that VCs will look at is just in terms of just your financial metrics. So getting somebody to help you put together a basic pitch deck is normally the first place. I think there are lots of firms that can actually help you with that. Of course, if you need some help, happy to volunteer. But just create a pitch deck first, and once you've got that pitch deck and you kind of know how much you want to raise or how you're thinking about the raise, then it's to go to specific VCs, because different VCs have different investment theses. And also in private markets, different venture and private equity funds also have a specific ticket size. So there'll be some which are seed, some which are pre-series A, some series A, B, C. So you then need to identify which VCs you want to go to, the ones you know have a thesis for the kind of business that you're building, because they'll have a greater affinity for that. And then to start identifying who do you want to reach out to and start having conversations with them. Again, another piece of advice, you should actually be talking to VCs before you're raising money. So you shouldn't be waiting to raise money to start building the relationships and networks with different VCs. it's a good idea to start a relationship with them, because ultimately a lot of what happens, and we were discussing this earlier, is a lot of what happens in the financial services space is relationships, networks that you build, and you shouldn't be waiting for a point when you need them. You need to start investing in those relationships from day one itself. But happy to help.
But generally you will need to have external help, because to come back to your question, I mean exactly what Soumya is saying, but obviously to do all the steps that Soumya is saying, you would need external help. And also somebody who understands the VC ecosystem, which you may not.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you so much for the valuable insight you gave us today. My question is that I have a good finance background educationally, by education, but in like international CFA, Indian CFA, Masters in Finance, Technical and Derivative Analysis. I cleared all in 2010. So due to getting, getting married at an early age or family planning, I had a long gap. I want to get back to professional field. And I'm really looking forward, but I'm again skeptical to start, where to start. And when I approach any MNCs or any investment banking firms, they ask me for a full-time investment, but which I'm not able to do as of now because of younger kids. So is there anything I can get back into? It's been a long gap.
I don't have enough information, but I do know there are entities, including, I think there was a Tata initiative also about for women who have taken a gap to come back, but whether part-time, flexi-time kind of things are available, I don't know. But don't get discouraged, it's not easy. Even I know IIM alumni who've taken even just a 2-year gap and not found it very easy to come back. But now if you search, I don't know the details of the organizations, but I have read about multiple organizations who help with that.
Yeah, so this is, I think, one of the toughest situations that women face after taking a career break, and how do they get back into the workforce, more so given that particularly in larger corporates, they have a program through which women can come back. Of course, they have to deal with the seniority of the woman and so forth. But we found that for a lot of smaller companies, this is the talent that they're actually seeking. So particularly in the startup world or in the early stages of a company, your skills would be extremely valuable. And because most people wouldn't even have a sense of finance or how to even be a quote-unquote, even a CFO for those young companies. So I think it's also a question of where you search for the role. Are you searching for the role in large corporates and MNCs? It may be more difficult. If you're looking at smaller companies that are willing to give you the flexibility, then maybe that's really where you want to search. But it's tougher.
I think a second option turns out to be better for me, little flexible with the timings, and work maybe not a very high scale pay, that's okay, but I'll be able to learn more, which I'm interested in, and maybe with time, as I get more responsible, I'll be able to give better time to companies.
Yeah, maybe you'll find somebody in this room
itself.
room,
actually, I think we could just match off one requirement here itself.
We'll just take one last question, and then Soumya and Devina are here joining us for tea, so you can continue to interact with them. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I am Asha from Flow, Delhi chapter. I have 2 questions for both the speakers. What is your advice on investment for people like us who are in between the age of 70 and 80? And the second question is, what is your opinion about engaging a fund advisor?
You mean an investment advisor?
Investment.
If you have some ideas, please go ahead.
So, like I mentioned earlier, it's never too late. So you can definitely start. It is better to be, with an investment advisor, because the investment advisor will take you through the different asset classes. in terms of, understand what your risk profile is, what is your objective at this age to, what does the investment mean to you, what is your objective, basis that, create an asset allocation which we spoke about earlier, and then let the investment advisor handhold you on the entire decision-making process. But you must start.
So I think, just to Neeta's point, why do people have wealth advisors, right? There's so much of the market today which is a do-it-yourself kind of market. But when I think about our role, why do we exist? We exist because we try and help through techniques like asset allocation, enhance the returns on a particular portfolio. But equally important, we try to prevent the accidents. You prevent the downside of suddenly losing a lot of money because you've constructed the portfolio in the right way. And also, many of you may have day jobs, other things that you do, and you can't be constantly looking at markets all the time, but that's what advisors will do. And that's what they're paid to do. So in that sense, having the advisor is just having a good sounding board who's also with you in your journey. That's how you need to look at them.
We'll close for questions. They're around for tea, so you can, catch them. Soumya?
Thank you, Soumya and Devina. It's been an insightful and thought-provoking conversation. I would summarize it as a small class in financial clarity, courage, and conviction. And now, before we close, I'm delighted to share a special initiative, the YFlow Privilege Card. It's a curated card celebrating and supporting businesses by our very own YFlow members. And I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the powerhouse team behind this, Kashmira, Shivantika, Daman, Stuti, and Isha, for really bringing this idea to life. And I would like to invite Devina and Soumya to officially launch the YFlow Privilege Card.
So for the first time, the Privilege Card features businesses wholly owned by YFlow or Flow members, no external businesses. And when we sent out inquiries for this, over 60 plus members have participated and given offers. So you will get it as a digital link today, and you can all avail it, whether you're a YFlow or Flow member.
Thank you so much. As the session comes to a close, I hope this fireside chat has left us all with a renewed sense of purpose and reminded us why it's so important for women to be financially aware and empowered. A heartfelt thank you to both Soumya and Devina for so generously sharing your stories, your insights, and your wisdom with us today. I'd also like to thank our entire committee for putting together this event with so much thought and care. A big round of applause for everyone, please. YFlow extends its sincere thanks to our event sponsor, Waterfield, for championing this conversation. We're also grateful to our gifting partner and to our design and communication partner, TCC, for giving shape and voice to today's message. May I please invite Mrs. Jayanti Dalmia on stage to felicitate our esteemed speakers, Devina, Soumya, and our moderator, Neeta Shivadasani.
Okay. Lovely meeting. It was a beautiful conversation. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, she's a past president of Flow National and also my mother-in-law. Mother-in-law. Trees It's fantastic. It's wonderful. Yeah, it's really nice. Thank you so much. It was very nice. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here. Very good conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's very sweet.
Could we all get a picture? Could the committee please stand for pictures?
So just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Please join us for coffee also with Devina and Soumya. And I request the YFlow committee to come together for a group photograph with our guests.